here you have a natural place that's God made, or whoever you believe in. And it just shows that how bad segregation was to me, you know, that you could take a natural, beautiful spot like that and say, you can't come here, you know, but you can work here, you know. And so that is part of the story of Silver Springs. You know, Silver Springs, you know, wasn't the only place like that, but at least I think the beauty of it is that Paradise Park was open, and so people did have this beautiful spot for 20 years.
How do places like Silver Springs and Paradise Park fit into the cultural history of Florida? You know, into our fabric of what makes Florida unique.
Silver Springs was developed first, and Silver Springs obviously has a spring there, okay, and it was always an attraction to Native Americans. It was an attraction to, you know, early visitors to Florida in the, you know, late 1800s, early 19th century. They would get on those steamboats and come up and see that big spring. And it was amazing, you know, because it was so big and so deep and so beautiful. And so, you know, people like Harriet Beecher Stowe came up and wrote about it. And so all the travelers that came to Florida would visit these springs, whether it was Weeki Wachee, Silver Springs, Rainbow Springs. And so they were so deep and clear that you could look down and see all the way to the bottom. You know, that's how clear the water was. So there was a real attraction to people, and that's how Silver Springs started as an attraction. Was someone invented the glass bottom boat, and then people would go out on those boats.
How does Paradise Park factor into the bigger picture in Florida of places that were available and welcoming to African Americans? I've heard of American Beach over near Jacksonville.
Right.
But besides that, how many other attractions were there for African Americans during segregation?
Paradise Park was the only roadside attraction that was. It was the only roadside attraction that built a separate park for African Americans. So there was American Beach, which was owned by black people, right? Abraham Lewis, I think, the Afro Insurance Company, right? Millionaire. He built that originally for his company, right? Company place, Getaway. But it became really popular with everybody. And then you had Butler Beach, St. Augustine, also owned by an African American. Frank Butler, who owned the Palace Market, became really rich and bought property and built the Butler Cottages on Anastasia Island over there. So, and then there were some parks like Lake Talbot Island. I think they had a little separate segregated beach. In Miami, you have Virginia Key.
So other than those places you mentioned, if you were an African American during those days of segregation, you just couldn't show up to a public beach.
I was interviewing Bill Maxwell, who is a columnist. He's African American. He's a columnist with the St. Pete Times and Tampa Bay Times newspaper. And so I thought, well, maybe he went to Paradise Park. And during our interview, he told me, he said, you know, with all the coastline of Florida, you know, you would have to sneak into the Atlantic Ocean if you were black. You would have to find a place to sneak in, and I just found that to be heartbreaking to hear out loud, you know.
So I think Silver Springs began operating under the ownership of Ray and Davidson, the two men.
They were the modern owners, you know, from like 1920s on. They were the ones that really turned it into an attraction.
And they were aggressive advertisers.
Oh yeah, they
all
were
over the United States.
Very aggressive advertisers. And Florida was segregated. Okay, so you could have a boat captain who could work at Silver Springs, but could not bring his own family there after hours. He couldn't come there as a citizen. He could only come there to work.
Right.
And that was true of a lot of Florida attractions. Rainbow Springs had black boat captains. Cypress Gardens had the black waiters in the restaurant. They could work there, but they couldn't visit there. And so when Silver Springs became you know, a nationwide attraction, like one fella called it the Disney World of its day. You know, it was really popular. And so they would advertise all over the country. So you would have African Americans coming from up north, and they would see the signs and they would want to stop at Silver Springs. And what would happen is Silver Springs did not have an admission. And so African Americans would literally go in there. But one of the boat captains, Roosevelt Faison, told me that if they wanted to get on a boat any of the paid attractions, they would be asked to leave. Originally, I thought, well, you know, Shorty Davidson and Carl Ray just built Paradise Park. And I found out that it was the boat captains that really pushed for that. You know, they wanted to visit. They felt the sting of working there and not being able to take their families out and wanting them to see. Who doesn't want to see Silver Springs? Even Eddie Vernon, he was born in Silver Springs in, I think, 1897. So he grew up going there as a kid before it became like an attraction. You know, it was just an open space. You know, and he used to greet the steamboats that came up. So there was a bit of irony when they opened it, and they placed an ad in the paper in the 40s saying that, you know, colored people, because they use the word colored people in the ad, colored people can see Silver Springs. So it was a bit of irony there because they had always been there, always.
And I would imagine the boat captains at Silver Springs were probably pretty prominent players on the scene there, and probably had a fair amount of influence. With the bosses.
They did, and you know, they were integral to Silver Springs' success because people liked to hear their stories, and that was one of the reasons, you know, Silver Springs hired black boat captains because, you know, they were good storytellers. You know, they had been there, you know, there were boatmen that ended up working for Silver Springs that had been out there in the 20s working, right? And so they were very familiar with everything. And not just that, but I want to mention the fact that some of the steamboats that would come up, the Hart line, I think, had black captains on it.
They did, the Hart and the Lucas lines,
right,
both, which was unusual. A lot of the Ocklawaha River and St. Johns River steamboats did employ African-American pilots and boat captains, which was kind of unusual for the rest of the country.
So what you have is you have at Silver Springs, you have boat captains who are all African-American, who are really featured on all the brochures and stuff as a center attraction because the glass bottom boat was the main attraction. And, you know, they couldn't bring their families out, but sometimes the owners would allow them to bring out family after hours, like family, or sometimes church groups would come out after hours. But as one of the interviewees, Henry Jones, told me, they couldn't scream when they saw an alligator because then people would know they were out there. And I think it was the pressure from the boat captains wanting to bring their families there that kind of led Ray and Davidson to buy the property down the river. I'm sure it wasn't just the pressure from the boat captains. I'm sure there was money involved. You know, they could see we can make money doing this. And so they opened Paradise Park. It opened on Emancipation Day, May 20th, 1949. In Florida, that's Florida's Emancipation Day. It was 2 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Eddie Vernon, Mr. Eddie Vernon, had been a Silver Springs boat captain. And he was also a leader in the community. He taught at Bethune-Cookman. I think he taught mechanics. He did all kinds of things. And so he was highly respected. And so they tapped him to run it, to become the manager. And his whole family, from the little kids all the way up, worked there.
I see.
And so he got to run the concessions and made money on that. What they would do is when enough people came for a boat ride at Paradise Park, they would radio up to Silver Springs, and they would say, send the boat down.
So it was not two separate fleets.
It wasn't two separate fleets, and that's one of the ironies was that it was the same boats, you know, segregated, right? So white people, and people told me that sometimes white people would be on one boat going down and African Americans would be on another boat going up and they would wave at each other.
That's so strange today.
Right. Eddie Vernon was one of the reasons it was such a beautiful, safe place. His grandson, Reginald Lewis, told me that his grandfather ran it like a little kingdom, you know. Nothing was out of place. Everybody was well behaved. Even certain songs in the jukebox, if he didn't like it, he would turn the jukebox off.
He'd censor the music.
He would censor
it. A little too racy, maybe.
So basically, Eddie Vernon was the sole, he was the main, I think, you know, he was the reason it was such a beautiful place. And he also had a car that he had put these signs on, you know, to advertise Paradise Park. So he would drive all the way up into Alabama, Georgia, you know, and everybody would know about it. And so they would come down. So you had church groups, you had school groups come in, you had buses from all over the country, busloads of people would come.
I've heard it referred to as a safe refuge, very family oriented. But you can imagine during segregation and the Jim Crow laws of the South, which were the dark part of our history, to say the least.
Right.
It must have been a relief for families to be able to go there.
Silver Springs did have the boats, and they had the attractions like Ross Allen, his alligator thing up there. But Paradise Park, you could come and put down a blanket and have a picnic with your family, and there were picnic tables, and there was basketball and shuffleboard and things like that. So it was much more interactive. Families would get dressed up. I mean, they would come out and swim too, and they had a dock out there. And so it was such an important place for people to come to. The veterans sponsored a beauty contest at Paradise Park every Labor Day, and that was a huge event. So you had, and they did it to raise money for a hospital. That was why they did it.
Oh, okay.
And so what they did is each individual post across the state would have a local beauty contest, right? And they would send the contestants up to Paradise Park. And the crowds would be enormous on Labor Day. It was huge.
And what about the baptisms?
Well, they would have baptisms. The black churches would come out sometimes on Easter Sunday, but other times they would come on a regular Sunday, I guess, early in the morning. And they would have the baptism in the river because a lot of churches didn't have baptismal pools. It was an oasis, really. If you think about Florida, by the 1930s, Florida had more lynchings than any other state. And Florida was a dangerous place for African Americans. You had a Ocoee incident where, people were run out of the town.
Right, Rosewood.
Were run out of the town. You had Rosewood. You had the Groveland case. So Paradise Park was a safe place. A family could go out there and have a beautiful day and not worry about anyone. And in fact, some of the people I talked to were children when they went, and they didn't understand that things were segregated. Their parents protected them. A lot of parents protected their children. And so one woman I interviewed, she said that she asked her mom, about the segregation thing, and she understood that white people were up at Silver Springs and black people were at Paradise Park, and she said to her mom, don't they know we're swimming in the same water? So a child, couldn't understand, why are you segregating a natural space?
So what eventually happened to Paradise Park?
So what happened is in 1962, Silver Springs was sold to ABC, American Broadcasting Company. And you have to understand it was also a collision too with the civil rights movement, right? So you had this push for desegregation. And so it was a combination of ABC buying it, and also the younger generation wanted to go. They wanted to be in other places. They wanted to be in places that they couldn't go to before.
The younger generation wanted to integrate.
They wanted to do integration and to do desegregation. And so no one knows exactly who bulldozed everything, but basically. Paradise Park the attendance went down, and some of that had to do with ABC slowing it down a little bit. Eddie Vernon retired, I think, in 1967, and I think his family members kept it going, but it gradually closed, and it was closed without any kind of input from the community, which was very hurtful. Why they couldn't just keep it open and let people go there? Why did they have to bulldoze it? So at that point, African Americans were welcome to go to Silver Springs, but many chose not to. And I talked to an attorney, Dorsey Miller, and he told me that he went to Silver Springs to give it a chance after Paradise Park closed, but he said he felt like a stranger in his own home. He said it wasn't integration, it was desegregation, because an integration would have been to leave it open and have both parks available.
Dr. Vickers, how did the book lead to other conversations? I know that it probably generated a lot of discussion. A lot of these images are available through the Florida archives. But when the book was published, how did it generate other conversations that maybe kept going and caused people to learn more?
Well, I teach at Tallahassee Community College, and I teach African American Lit. And as a result of doing this project, I decided to start having my students to interview their own family members who lived through segregation. And sometimes when they interview their grandmother or they find an older family friend to interview, a lot of times it's the very first time they've ever really talked about this to them. Because a lot of times older people who lived through these times don't want to, it's too painful to talk about, you know. And so it's a beautiful assignment for my students, because they a lot of times do find out, you know, what their ancestors and their family members went through on a personal level. And I tell them everyone's history is important, you know, they're part of this history. And so it's a really valuable tool, I think, if you're working with students, to have them understand that their own family is part of history.